Hi everybody, today I am going to read you the story of Mr Grumpy. Now, I don't know if I've run Mr Grumpy before. I haven't recorded Mr Grumpy, so it might be we've done it before in the long distant past, but maybe therefore you can remember Mr Grumpy. He's dressed a bit the same as my waistcoat today. So he is blue. He's a rectangle. He's almost exact perfect rectangle is his shape, which is quite unusual for one of the Mr. Men or the Little Misses, isn't it? And he's got a very strong, sort of purplish, I think I'd call it, purple nose. And then he has a tiny little top hat. What colour is that? Anybody know? So he's blue. He's got a purpley blue nose, and on the top of his head is a little green hat. There is Mr. Grumpy, and I think you'll agree he looks pretty grumpy. Let's see what happens and whether we can stop him being grumpy. Anyway, it was a lovely summer evening. Mr. Grumpy was at home. His home was called Crosspatch Cabbage. Sorry, not Crosspatch. Did I say Crosspatch Cabbage? It can't be. He was at home at Crosspatch Cottage. Cabbage, dearie me. Crosspatch is a phrase, I think more of an American phrase, really. It's a phrase sometimes we people say when they think someone's been a bit grumpy or a bit grouchy. Well, you're a real crosspatch today. He sat in an armchair. He picked up a book, and then, do you know what he did? Oh, no. You should never do that to books. He tore all the pages out. Everyone. Because Mr. Grumpy can't stand books. And he has a shocking bad temper. In fact, he's quite the most bad-tempered person you can imagine. Grumpy by name, and even more grumpy by nature. The following morning, he was out in his garden pulling up flowers. We just pull him out of the ground because he can't stand pretty flowers growing in his garden. And out of the corner of his eye, he saw a figure. Oh no! It was Mr. Happy. You can tell from the smile, can't you? You couldn't remember what colour he was. Good morning, said Mr. Happy in his happy voice. Good, said Mr. Grumpy. What's good about it? But nothing, went on Mr. Grumpy. Get out of my garden. I beg your pardon, Mr. Happy. You heard me, snapped Mr. Grumpy. Go away. I say, laughed Mr. Happy. You are a bad-tempered fellow, aren't you? Humph, grunted Mr. Grumpy. And, went on Mr. Happy, bad-tempered fellows need to change their ways. Rubbish, retorted Mr. Grumpy, and he went into his cottage, deliberately stepping on Mr. Happy's foot as he passed him. Ouch, said Mr. Happy, and bang went the door of Crosspatch Cottage as Mr. Grumpy slammed it behind him. And there is poor old Mr. Happy jumping up and down with a sore foot. Mr. Happy stood there looking not quite so happy as he normally does. His foot hurt. He thought. And he thought. Then he thought some more, and then he had an idea. He smiled, and he went to see Mr. Tickle. Now we know what Mr. Tickle is good at. Mr. Happy told Mr. Tickle of his idea of how to get Mr. Grumpy to change his ways. Mr. Tickle grinned the sort of grin that goes from ear to ear. That is, if you have ears, which, as it happens, as you can see, look, Mr. Tickle and Mr. Happy don't have ears. Oh, he grinned, rubbing his hands at the end of those extremely long arms of his together. That sounds fun. That afternoon, Mr. Grumpy went to town shopping. He walked into Mr. Meat's shop. Mr. Meat, obviously, is the butcher. Give me some sausages, snapped Mr. Grumpy, and be quick about it. Poor Mr. Meat, who was rather frightened of Mr. Grumpy, did as he was told, but as he was doing as he was told, something appeared through the shop doorway. Do you know what it was? And can you see, right at the bottom of the picture, I can see Mr. Tickle's fingers coming through. Can you? What do you think Mr. Tickle is going to do? It was on the end, that little hand was on the end of an extraordinarily long arm belonging to, well, I think you probably guessed it, belonging to Mr. Tickle. He came in through the door. went all the way across the shop up to Mr Grumpy and tickled him. "Oh!" squeaked Mr Grumpy in alarm, dropping his sausages and looking round to see what had happened. But could he see anything? Of course not, because Mr Tickle and pulled his arm away again. "Humph!" grunted Mr Grumpy and picked up his sausages and went next door to the cake shop. Crash went the door of the shop. "Give me a cake," snapped Mr Grumpy, "and hurry up." Poor Mrs Ferry, who sold cakes, like fairy cakes, I suppose, was frightened of Mr Grumpy, so did as she was told. But as she was doing, she was told. Guess what happened next? "Oh!" shrieked Mr Grumpy, dropping his cake and his sausages. He could not understand what was happening. Now, of course, often when you're tickled, you have a giggle, don't you? But Mr Grumpy isn't doing that. Anyway, the same thing happened at Mr Daly's, the newspaper shop, at Mrs Humbug's, the sweet shop, and Mr Dottle's dairy, and of course at Mr Packett's, the grocer's. It went on all afternoon, and all afternoon Mr Grumpy kept being tickled. He kept dropping his shopping and picking it up and being tickled and dropping his shopping and picking it up and being tickled and dropping his shopping, and he just could not understand it. On his way home to Crosspatch Cottage, he met Mr Happy again. "Hello," grinned Mr Happy, "having a nice day?" "Get out of my way," snapped Mr Grumpy, "before I kick you." And almost before the words had passed his lips, that extraordinary long arm of Mr Tickle's had appeared from behind a tree and tickled him yet again. Mr Grumpy jumped in the air and dropped all his shopping again and fell over. Mr Happy looked down at Mr Grumpy lying amid a jumble of sausages and cakes and newspapers and sweets and milk and cornflakes. "I think," he laughed, "that if you were to change your ways and not be quite so bad-tempered quite so often, this sort of thing might not happen to you quite so often." "Humph!" grunted Mr Grumpy. He picked up all his shopping again and went home to Crosspatch Cottage. But on his way, he did think a bit about what Mr Happy had said, and because he very definitely did not like what had happened to him that afternoon. Mr Happy and Mr Tickle laughed and shook hands. And so, after that, he did try to be not quite so bad-tempered quite so often, and what he actually found was, the more he tried, the less he found he was tickled. So he tried more and more. These days, he's quite a changed person. And in fact, you might find if you've got a really sulky on, if you're feeling really miserable, if you're feeling really grumpy, sometimes you could try not to be grumpy and think, well, all right, but I'm going to be happy for a bit, or I'm going to be nice to somebody, or I might just smile. It's amazing how you stop being grumpy and also you feel better. And in fact, it says here, look, Mr Grumpy, only the other evening, he picked up a book. And do you know what? Oh, do you know, I thought he was going to say, do you know what? He read the book. He doesn't that much better, though. He actually only tore out one page. But that's better than tearing out the whole book, isn't it? So that is the story of Mr Grumpy. And if you're too grumpy, you just might get tickled. I hope you enjoyed that story. Be happy, don't be grumpy, and I'll talk to you again very soon.